This training is broken down into three main segments. And the reason why will become obvious as we go through it. But the first segment is going to be the sensory component, the sensory challenges, and how a sensory system is challenged if you are on the spectrum. The second component is going to be communication challenges, and we're going to end, the third component is going to be with missing persons and missing person behavior and some techniques to locate missing individuals who are on the spectrum. The reason why I end with that and the reason why I start with sensory is going to become clear. I believe, my opinion, the sensory challenges, the sensory component of this is the key. That if you can understand the challenges that somebody on the spectrum deals with from a sensory level on a daily basis, it will unlock a lot of the rest of this, okay, including communication challenges and including missing persons behavior. Okay, so I start off with sensory and I hit it hard, then we'll move into communication and then missing persons. Okay. All right, so let's get into it. Sensory challenges. I'm a fan of the autistic mind. I think it's beautiful. I think it's amazing in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, I'm envious of individuals like my son who can see the world in a different way than I do, than you do. The autistic brain is a different operating system. Okay, it's wired differently than the neurotypical brain, and a lot of it goes through the sensory system. So we've all learned in basic third grade, in science class, we learned what the 5 basic senses are: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. Okay, those are the 5. We all learned that, and we kind of know what they are. It's kind of intuitive at this point. That's our basic 5 senses. There are 2 more I didn't know existed before I became a student of this with my son, and they are just as critical as the other 5, and that's called proprioceptive sense and vestibular sense. And we'll go into those in a few minutes, but just right now we'll start off with the basics, the 5 basic senses, okay? These senses, for you and me, it's very difficult for me to explain how challenges to any one of these senses can affect behavior, but there is a direct line on how sensory challenges affects behavior. Okay, and we're going to go into that in a few minutes. So let's start off with sight, what we see. Okay, it's easy for me to have you imagine having a hyposensitive sense of sight, to have a limited ability to see. Okay, I would ask you to just close your eyes and imagine living in a world where you're blind, where you cannot see anything. That's very easy for me to communicate. It's easy for you to wrap your brain around. You can understand that challenge. For somebody on the spectrum, they may have a hindered ability to see. They also have a heightened, a hypersensitive sense of sight. Okay, and that's harder for me to communicate to you. But imagine not being able to filter out all of the different sights you see. It's the exact opposite of being blind, where you see everything at the same time. Okay, you have no ability to filter out extraneous data with what you need to focus on to get something done, to communicate, to pay attention to. So you live in a world where you are bombarded by sight. You and I sitting here, and you're a polite individual and you want to listen to what I say, we're able to filter out things going on around us. Okay, we're able to filter out the dust particles that filter through the lights. We're able to filter out somebody walking next to us or coming into our field of vision if we're communicating to somebody, because we're focused on that individual and what they're saying. So subconsciously, without us even knowing it, our brain kind of applies this filter to our world where we can not pay attention to or not enter into our consciousness a million different sensory impulses that we're being hit with. Okay, right up until I point it out, and then you see everything. Okay, that's the way it works. Somebody on the spectrum has a challenge doing that they receive this sensory input all the time, and they have a hard time filtering it out. Okay, individuals on the spectrum report to experts that they will sit in a room and actually count the flickering of a fluorescent bulb. That the lights over their heads, the bulb flickers so many times, and they can tell you how many times it just flickered in the last minute, because they can't filter it out. It's just a constant thing in their heads that their brain gives as much attention to as the individual standing before them giving them instructions to take a test. So now you have hearing, and you go to how we filter out extraneous sounds all the time, and you're sitting there and there's probably a lot going on, and if you're in your car watching it on your laptop, there's traffic going on, and you may hear the hum of the heater in your car or the air conditioner. There's people outside, your radio's going off, you're almost subconsciously listening to what was just said on the radio, and if it applies to you, if you have to go back up one of your other officers, all these things going on a sound level that you are able to filter out and focus on what I say. Okay? For somebody on the spectrum, they have a challenge doing that. So they hear all these things. They'll hear the hum of the motor and the whistle of the air conditioner and the traffic going by and people talking down the block and all of these things and a radio going on in the background, and they have a challenging time filtering that stuff out. Now you layer that on top of the visual component, and they can't filter out the visual sense, and then you have the hearing sense, and you start to get a picture of how challenging somebody's life is who's on the spectrum, who has a difficult time doing that. Okay, they have to go out and interact in the world, and they are constant bombardment and assault on their sensory system because they lack the ability to apply this filter that you and I can do almost subconsciously. Okay, and that's just two senses. That's sight and hearing. When you fold into the mix smell, and that's kind of one we don't think about a lot. But right now, while you're sitting there talking, listening to me, you're smelling a lot going on in your car. Some is bad, some is good. Okay, we kind of can shut that off when we need to, when we have to focus on something that's important, like the individual before us who's trying to give us information. Then you go to touch. Now, touch is it's an abstract concept, but it's important. Individuals on the spectrum report to experts that sometimes just the sense of somebody touching their arm causes physical discomfort or pain. Okay, not squeezing, not pinching, not scratching, but just touching them on the arm causes pain. And it's because they're so hypersensitive to that sense in their body is so hypersensitive that the slightest touch causes pain. So there are parents out there, tragically, who will tell you that they have never been able to hug their child. They've never been able to embrace their child and give them a hug because it causes pain to their child. You can imagine from a parent's perspective the impact of that not being able to hug and embrace and tickle and all these things we do with our kids, and not being able to do that because that child's sense of touch is so hypersensitive that those things cause pain. Taste, the same. Okay, there's an entire industry out there I didn't know existed. It's called feeding therapy. With my son, his sense of taste was so sensitive, and it ties into texture as well, which has in the touch component, but his sense of taste and texture were so powerful that for the first 7 years of his life, we could not get him to eat anything other than bacon and juice. That was it. It got to a point where we actually started to fear for his health, that he wasn't getting the nutrients, because anything he put in his mouth that was a different texture or taste caused a physical reaction, and it usually resulted in throwing up. So we had to bring him to a therapist for a number of years who actually had to teach his body to accept, understand, and process different tastes and textures. And that process was grueling. And it took a long time. And it started off with him just tolerating a different food in the room with him. And over several weeks, then eventually tolerating that food being on a table near him. And then after several more weeks, tolerating touching that food. And then, I'm not talking about like some exotic food, I mean like a chicken breast. And actually, eventually, over months, touching it to his tongue. And then over more months, putting in his mouth and not even swallowing it yet, we'll get there later, actually just chew it 5 times and spit it out. And this took years just to get my son to try and ingest a different food that was off-putting to him on a textural level. That is how powerful this sensitivity to food and taste and touch is. And that exists through all the senses, that level of sensitivity. Now, somebody on a spectrum can be either hypersensitive to sensory input or hyposensitive. So at the other end, where you have somebody who you cannot touch because it causes pain, you have other people, like my son, by the way, who is craving sensory input. He's craving being touched. He'll crawl up on your lap and he'll want you to squeeze him. And he likes to wear heavy blankets and clothing on his body because he likes the weight of it on his body. He's in constant movement, and he's always sensory craving on that level. Okay, so that's an example where you could have, there's 2 opposite ends of the spectrum, where don't ever touch me because it hurts, and somebody who is overly affectionate to a point where he will go to a stranger and ask for a hug or take somebody's hand because he's craving that sensory input, and you have everybody in between. Now here's where it gets spicy with this. Individuals where they fall on that spectrum changes and fluctuates on a momentary basis. So you may have somebody who is very, very sensory craving, like my son, who's constantly looking for input, but where he gets to a point where he's had enough, or his body hits a trigger and it becomes way too much, and he becomes very, very sensitive, and you can't touch him for a while because he has to come down. So the individual fluctuates where they are on this sensory spectrum component too, if that makes sense. Okay, so I understand there's a lot there, and you have just this array of, oh my God, how are they affected? How am I supposed to know? Well, you can't know, but you can understand that it exists, and you can ask some questions. If you understand this sensory component, you're there. You can unlock a lot of these behaviors and understand a lot of what's going on. All right. So that's a basic outline of the sensory component. I can give you some more details on how it impacts them as we go. All right. But the reason why I start with it and I hit it hard is because this is the key. Sensory is the key to getting to navigating a lot of these calls and a lot of these behaviors that we're going to see as cops. All right. Somebody with sight sensitivity, they may have poor depth perception. They may have poor coordination. They may be comfortable focusing on tiny little details of something as opposed to looking at a broad field of vision. So you'll have somebody who will look at a keyboard on a computer and just focus on the individual letters, and they're not comfortable sitting back and taking in a broad scene. Okay, and you're going to see very quickly that a lot of these things, like poor depth perception, poor coordination, distorted vision, they mimic what they teach us in the police academy to be impacted by intoxication or drug impairment. Okay, these are the things they taught us in the police academy to look for a drunk driver. Poor coordination, they're swerving. They can't hold the keys. They go to the glove box. They're trying to get their documents, and they can't focus. They can't walk the line in front of them, a straight line. Right? These are actually our psychophysical tests to determine whether you're impaired or intoxicated. Touch your nose, say your ABCs. All of these things. Yes, they could be drunk. They more than likely they are intoxicated, but they all could be signs that they are on the spectrum as well. Okay, so be very, very careful. And make sure that you don't have such a narrow laser focus on locking up the drunk that you ignore other signs there that there's something else there. Okay. Sounds may be amplified or distorted. They may be, like I said, difficult filtering out background noises. They may have a hard time modulating their own voice because they can't judge how loud to speak or how to lower their voice. With my son, if we go to church, he talks loudly, and we can teach him to whisper. All right, he can understand what whisper means, but it's hard for him to, it's almost like telling somebody to sing who has terrible pitch. It's hard for him to modulate it and actually do what we're asking. Okay? Just understand this, that this exists. That's all I'm asking. Understand that these sensitivities exist, and these individuals live in a world that's different than you or me. In the world, you'll see our guys wearing earmuffs, like ear protection that you or I wear to the range when we qualify with our weapon. My son has a pair of them for himself in his backpack. And he's at a point now where he understands that if we go to a mall or an amusement park, or we're out in the world, going to the supermarket or whatever, the noise may be just too much for him. So he knows he can take these things out of his backpack, put them on, and let him and filter out a lot of that noise that's going on. And so you'll see these individuals out in the world wearing these earmuffs, okay? You'll see them wearing dark sunglasses when it's not really that sunny out. It's not a fashion statement, okay? These things are providing them a level of filtration. They're letting them be comfortable and just exist and operate in this wacky world that they're forced to live in, okay? Just understand that they learn techniques and tools to just survive in our world. And if you're just empathetic towards that, it'll get you a long way into understanding a lot of this, okay?